Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell and Company, I would like to welcome you to Giving USA 2020, a virtual forum on philanthropy. We want to thank the Chronicle of Philanthropy, our media sponsor, and all of you for joining us today. I'm joined by my colleagues Peter Fissinger, President and CEO of Campbell and Company, and Christina Yoon, Vice President and East Region Director. We are joined by our esteemed panel, Kelly Dolan, Chief Marketing and Development Officer of Ronald McDonald House Charities, Dr. Helene D. Gayle, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, and Stacy Palmer, Editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy. On behalf of everyone attending today's webinar, thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell and Company webinars. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you do experience any visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell and Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will last 90 minutes. With your participation, you will earn 1.5 continuing education credits that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes a link to download your certificate, along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We'll also be holding time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Peter Fissinger and Christina Yoon. In his 25 years with Campbell and Company and throughout his 35-year career, Peter Fissinger has served as an advocate and a student of generosity. He is a second generation fundraiser with a lifelong commitment to collaborating with donors and nonprofit organizations to advance critically important missions. Peter has worked to help Campbell and Company evolve from a fundraising consulting firm to a diversified professional service firm addressing the full scope of institutional advancement needs of the nonprofit sector. A frequent speaker and writer on philanthropy and generosity, Peter serves as Vice Chair of the Giving Institute and is a member of the Executive Committee and Board of Managers of the YMCA of Metropolitan Chicago. He is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross. Christina Yoon is a dedicated nonprofit professional who uses her broad experience when advising clients while bringing a fresh perspective to each engagement. Tina began her career in development by serving as a senior liaison officer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Office of Corporate Relations and as a development officer. Originally educated as a scientist, she worked as a researcher at Fissinger for several years before fully realizing her passion for working with mission-driven nonprofit organizations. Prior to coming to Campbell and Company, Tina was an independent consultant for 6 years. Tina is the founder of the Council of Korean Americans and a member of the AFP DC chapter and the AFP International IDEA committee. She obtained a Bachelor in Sciences in Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry from Yale and a PhD in Biology from MIT. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Christina Yoon.
You're on mute, Tina.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Wonderful to be with you. And before I jump into the data presentation, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic and the groundswell of anti-racism protests in the U.S. have already changed philanthropy, and the full impact of this change may not be realized for many months or years to come. And thus, some of you may be wondering whether the giving data from 2019 even matters, and asking yourselves, why are we here today? Well, we recognize that the world is indeed different now, and we've all been trying to adapt as best we can. And hopefully a look back at some historical context and seeing how philanthropy responded in previous uncertain or difficult times may provide some insight and serve as a guide. It will not necessarily be predictive, however, so we are especially looking forward to our discussion today with leaders in the field to consider what we know and how we might respond. Okay, now for a quick review of our agenda. I'm going to first talk through what is Giving USA. I'm going to review the data on 2019 contributions, both by source and recipient type. We're going to look at some trends in giving, how to respond in 2020, and the most important part, we'll have a panel discussion. So the Giving USA Annual Report on Philanthropy is the longest running annual report on U.S. charitable giving. This report is published by the Giving USA Foundation, which was begun in 1956 by the American Association of Fundraising Council, now called the Giving Institute. It's researched and written by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. This research is made possible by contributions from the Giving Institute member firms, foundations, and other donors listed on this slide. As a member of the Giving Institute, Campbell and Company is proud to support this work and to have this opportunity to present the data to you today. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the data. So in 2019, what we saw is that charitable giving in the United States reached almost $450 billion. This was an increase of 4.2% over 2018. And despite some fear of recession, these strong results were achieved because the economy overall was strong. So for example, personal disposable income rose 4.2%, GDP rose 4.1%, and the S&P 500 rose 28.9%. This created a very favorable environment for charitable giving in 2019. Taking a look at the sources of contributions, you can see that giving by individuals comprised the greatest percentage at 69%. Giving by foundations, which includes grants made by independent, community, and operating foundations, amounted to 17% of all gifts in 2019. Giving by bequests accounted for 10%, and giving by corporations came in at 5%. Now, I'd like to note that giving by individuals is actually greater than the 69% that you see represented here in the pie chart, because about half of foundations are actually family foundations, which represent individual giving, and bequests are representative of individual giving as well. So in total, we can say that individuals gave more than 87% of the contributions in 2019. Thus, we believe that it's important for organizations to develop a strong individual giving program, because without it, you're probably not leveraging the full philanthropic potential that you could. So now the next slide shows changes in giving by source from 2017 to 2019. So taking a look at the sources of contributions, well, in total, as I mentioned earlier, was a 4.2% increase from 2018 to 2019. It was pretty flat, actually, looking from 2017 to 2018. But in all, it came to 4.1% increase over that 3-year period. If we break it down by the sources, individuals was down by 2.3% from 2017 to 2018, but then up to 4.7% from 2018 to 2019. Total was an increase of 2.3%. For foundations, it was higher from 2017 to 2018 at 4.4%, 2.5% for 2018 to 2019. Total 7% increase over this time period. Bequests actually saw a great increase of 9.6% from 2017 to 2018. It was pretty flat last year. Total 9.8%. Corporations, on the other hand, were down 3.4% from 2017 to 2018. But then saw double-digit growth of 13.4% last year, so total 9.5%. In summary, you can see that there was strong growth, except in the area of bequests for last year. If we look at giving by source over a 40-year period, so this is looking at 5-year chunks from 1980 to the present, you can see that foundations and bequests over this period of time together have contributed larger shares of giving than in earlier years. And giving from individuals has steadily declined. So looking back in the early 80s, giving from individuals was marked at 82%, but you could see in the last 5-year period, it's closer to 70%. Giving by foundations has almost tripled over this period of time, from 6% early on to now 16%. A strong economy and changes in income inequality have led to the creation of more foundations and the growth of donor-advised funds. Giving from bequests, you can see, was between 7 to 9% over this period of time. It's influenced by the timing of the filing of the estate gift, and therefore it's subject to greater volatility. But overall, I'd say an aging demographic is leading to an overall increase in the percentage of gifts coming from from bequests. Excuse me. And finally, corporations, you can see, has remained pretty steady, hovering around 5% over this entire period of time. Now I'd like to shift to looking at how the $450 billion in charitable gifts was distributed. So this is looking at the recipient organizations. As has always been the case, religious organizations received the largest share of charitable gifts, and this came to 29% in 2019. However, I will note that this amount has been decreasing over time. The share of the pie has been decreasing. You can see education came in, again, 14%. That was second highest. Human services at 12%. That matched gifts to grant-making foundations. We have health at 9%, public society benefit at 8%, arts and culture and humanities at 5%, international affairs at 6%, environment and animals at 3%, and gifts to individuals at 2%. A brief note about donor advised funds. Gifts to DAFs are counted wherever the DAF sponsoring organization is classified. So if a gift to Fidelity or Vanguard or one of those organizations is given, it's counted in the public society benefit category. Gifts to DAFs at community foundations are counted as gifts to foundations, and gifts to DAFs held by nonprofit organizations are counted wherever that nonprofit is classified itself. So you can see that DAFs are spread out over multiple subsectors. Okay, so let's look at changes in giving by the type of recipient organization for the period of 2017 to 2019. Chart is similar to the previous one. You can see that overall in all 9 subsectors, giving has increased between 2017 to 2019, and that's shown in the numbers on the right. You can see religion has had some variability, increased higher by more from 2018 to 2019. Education had a really big increase from, if you compare what happened in 2017 to 2018, that was 1.9%, but then from 2018 to 19 was a 12.1% increase. Human services was at 2% previously, then up to 5%. Overall was at 7.1%. Foundations was one area in which it was relatively flat from 2017 to 2018, but then was up to 2.5% from 2018 to 2019. In the health area, 1.3% from 2017 to 2018, but then from 2018 to 19, we saw 6.8%. Public society benefit was at a lower level and actually negative in 2017 to 18, but then up to 13.1% in this previous time period. Arts and culture and humanities and also environment and animals were pretty similar to one another, both around 6%, 2017 to 2018, but then up in double digits in 2018 to 2019. The change in environmental affairs is kind of interesting because we saw that there was a really large increase from 2017 to 2018 at 13.8%, but then was the only category this last year that was down. So some people may be wondering why that might be the case, despite the strong economy. One possible explanation is that it could be because there were really no large-scale international natural disasters or international events that would have prompted contributions to this category. Overall, you can see that the trajectory for the last 3 years is, really positive at 13.4%. Now, we know that giving to education, arts and culture, and environments and animals tend to do really well when the economy is strong, and you can see that the data supports that, because these subsectors tend to attract larger gifts, typically made by high net worth individuals using appreciated securities. And now, given the economic impact of COVID-19 in 2020, we might expect that these trends will change in the coming year. For example, we might see that human services will see an increase, which was certainly the case during the Great Recession. And that the situation with the shutting down of the economy, though, this time around is actually pretty unique. So it's hard for us to actually predict what the impact on giving will be. For example, we've seen like an interesting twist. The arts and culture sector, which really is fighting for its survival at this moment, that has injected a great sense of urgency for donors to support this sector at this time. And then another side note related to the anti-racism movement, there have been a huge number of donations, many more millions of dollars that have gone towards organizations being led by people of color, by Black people, serving the Black community, looking at issues of anti-racism. Certainly this is going to have an impact on the results that we'll see next year. Okay, so some of those slides were a mouthful. I'm glad we're done with those. let's move on to trends in giving. So if we look at total giving for over the last 40 years, either in current dollars shown by the black line or by inflation-adjusted dollars shown in the gray and yellow columns, we can see that giving grows almost every year and is closely tied to the economy. Giving levels are stagnant or tend to decrease during recession years, which are shown in the yellow bars. One thing to note that in 2018, which is the second to last gray bar on the right, you can see that there was a decline in giving, and this was a non-recession year. So the question is, what happened? Tax reform was in place for the first time, which may have led to that negative impact. And another possibility is that even though the stock market did fairly well overall, the fourth quarter was pretty weak and had some volatility, and that may have caused some donors who typically give through securities at the end of the year to actually pull back. Okay, taking a look at GDP. Several economic factors relate to how much donors give to charity each year, and one of them is gross domestic product. And interestingly, although the total amount of charitable giving has been increasing steadily over time, it actually has remained as a pretty consistent percentage of GDP, hovering around 2% over the last 20 years, which you can see here. And so it demonstrates the economy is a strong driver of philanthropy, but the question for us is, how can we as a sector break through this? Imagine if charitable giving were to reach perhaps 2.5% of GDP. This would really transform the nonprofit sector. Stewardship and retention are critical to helping make this happen. So it's a challenge to all of you out there. Research has found that statistically significant correlation between changes in total giving and values on the Standard & Poor's 500 index. And because stock market values are an indicator of financial and economic security, households and corporations are more likely to give if the stock market is up. And we see that the direction of change and the robustness of growth in total giving generally lags slightly behind the S&P 500. And the changes in giving are not quite as dramatic. And so it's in these pockets of difference that there's an opportunity for organizations to retain their donors or to increase the giving for the donors that they already do have. So again, it's important to lean into fundraising best practices. My final data slide is showing the number of nonprofit organizations over this 10-year period from 2008 to 2018. You can see that in 2018, it reached 1.33 million nonprofits. This was a 3.2% increase over 2017. You can see that steady rise over time. The main point that we want to illustrate with this slide is that there is a lot of competition out there. And so keep in mind that if you're not reaching out to your donors, somebody else is. Okay, so what's next? I've made some reference to some of the best practices so far that the data underscores the importance of. But now I'd like to talk specifically about what you can be doing given the specific challenges that we're facing now. And we'll delve deeper into that with our panel discussion in a few moments. So how to respond in 2020. Here are some suggestions for you to keep in mind. The first is to position your organization to come out of the crisis strong. So we've all had to deal with the impact of the sudden shutdown of the economy, and it's been devastating for many in our sector. And it's affected about how we go about the business of fundraising. The key question to ask yourself in this kind of situation that you find yourself in is to think about what you can be doing now to best position you for success when we emerge from the crisis. So some of the options might be, you might be fighting for your survival due to the economic impacts of social distancing. Or you might be managing an influx of new donors because your mission is at the center of the crisis. Or maybe you're not quite sure where you fit in the current context of COVID or the anti-racist protests. So some examples would be to focus on clarifying your messaging or cleaning up your database or instituting a new recurring donation program, or possibly even just qualifying some new major gift prospects. So all of these things to keep in mind, what can you do now to help strengthen your organization for the future? Another point is that I've mentioned already is to focus on donor retention and stewardship. We know that donor retention rates have not really improved over many, many years. And so improvements in donor retention through solid, good stewardship will make a big difference. And investing in virtual yet meaningful engagement. I'm sure that many of, or most of you, have made the pivot to virtual engagement and are getting used to seeing everyone in little boxes on your screen. Well, it's going to actually be a while before we can travel to see donors face-to-face, or host fundraising galas, or have small cultivation events in people's homes. So in the meantime, we do want to emphasize it's important to continue to leverage virtual tools to engage your supporters. Here at Campbell & Company, we've been exploring with our clients how to go beyond the Zoom call to try to recreate aspects of what we love about in-person events that help bring our donors closer to our clients' mission. So this also moves right into this next point about using technology in new and creative ways. And here I'd like to say that considering multi-channel approaches to engage and attract your supporters will be critical in the coming months. I've been encouraging my clients to think of how it is that you can use and leverage assets that you already have in innovative and creative ways to maybe reach a new group, a new segment of your donors. Maybe some of those that are in, happen to reside in more remote areas that you typically didn't travel to. You can now engage them. You can engage people across time zones. It's a great opportunity moving forward. Another point is to stay in touch with your donors, and this is especially true during times of crisis and times of uncertainty. This is when your donors and your closest supporters want to hear from you most. So it's not possible to actually over-communicate. People will let you know if they think it's too much. There's always some of those out there, but certainly during this time of social distancing, we're finding that donors are hungry for it, and actually they're even more available to be able to engage because they're not running around all over the place with work or even with their family and personal lives. And then the last two are somewhat related to one another. So, and this also relates back to that first bullet point. For you to consider how you will respond will really require you to be very clear on what your mission is and for you to stay true to that mission. Your message can incorporate reference to COVID-19 or anti-racism, but it shouldn't actually cause you to veer off course from your core purpose. And then finally, this last point here, understanding your organization's role in the anti-racism movement. I think it's important for those of us who maybe are not actually at the front lines of that work that's being done. But the question that we as fundraisers could maybe be asking is, how can we create a more equitable fundraising practice? One that is inclusive of fellow fundraisers, donors, and volunteers of color, and think about what changes we might be able to make to the way in which we do our work moving forward. Okay, well, that takes us to the end of the data presentation. Thank you very much for your attention on that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Peter Fissinger, President and CEO of Campbell & Company, who will moderate the discussions with our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. Excuse me. Great job. Really interested to hear that information and also some of the comments that you made about how people can use the information. We're going to spend some time with our panelists and learn a little bit more, not just about what the data means, but we also want to just have an open conversation about where we are today, even though it's 6 months after the end of 2019. Since 2019, as Tina mentioned, the giving landscape has been transformed by COVID-19 and the calls for racial justice that were intensified by the tragic killing of George Floyd. So we really want to talk about the Giving USA results, but we also want to take advantage of these great panelists that we have to talk about philanthropy in general. I'm going to start by introducing each of our panelists. Kelly Dolan is Chief Marketing and Development Officer for Ronald McDonald House Charities. She has 30 years of experience in fundraising, marketing, event planning, and nonprofit management. You may know that RMHC serves 2.5 million children and their families annually through 65 countries and regions across the world. Kelly started her career at Leo Burnett before moving into nonprofit work in marketing development and strategy. She worked with the Children's Healthcare System, Susan G. Komen for the Cure, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and was executive director of the Atlanta Women's Foundation. Kelly's from Chicago, but all 4 of those stints took place in Atlanta. She told me that she lived in Atlanta for over 25 years. In 2017, she returned to Chicago and joined RMHC. Kelly, thank you for being with us today. Dr. Helene Gayle is president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, which is one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the United States. Dr. Gayle was formerly CEO of CARE for 10 years, a leading international humanitarian organization. Helene is known as an expert in global development, humanitarian, and health issues. She spent 20 years with the Centers for Disease Control. She was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and was with McKinsey, where she launched the McKinsey Social Initiative, a nonprofit that builds partnerships for social impact. Helene has an undergraduate degree from Barnard, an MD from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MPH from Johns Hopkins. And if that's not enough, she has 18 honorary degrees. I've got a long way to go to catch up to that. I think it's important to note that when Helene joined the Chicago Community Trust in 2017, one of the first things she did was build a strategic plan that focused on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region. And we'll be very interested to hear about that work and maybe the impact that the trust is able to have now in this important time and what the trust has learned about closing that racial and ethnic wealth gap. Helene, thanks for being with us today. Stacy Palmer is editor of the Chronicle Philanthropy. I want to thank Stacy not just for being here, but for co-sponsoring this event that we're having here today. Stacy has served as a top editor of the Chronicle Philanthropy since its founding in 1988. She's also overseen the development of the Chronicle's website, philanthropy.com. She's had a hands-on role in Philanthropy Today, the daily newsletter that COP puts out, and the webinar series for offering professional development in fundraising, grant-seeking, advocacy, marketing, and social media. Stacy is editor of Challenges for Philanthropy and Nonprofits, a book, and is former editor of Government Relations at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where she was prior to that company starting the Chronicle for Philanthropy. Stacy's a graduate of Brown and has served as chair of the Brown Alumni Magazine and is currently a member of Brown's Leadership Council. I just want to thank you also, Stacy, for being with us today. You know, I thought it would be good for each of you to just sort of start to tell us a little bit more about your organization and how it intersects with philanthropy, and to give us your sort of 20,000-foot reaction to the data, and maybe just a touch of how things have changed over the last 6 months. And so, Kelly, can I start with you, please? I think you're on mute, Kelly.
Thanks so much. So pleased to be a part of this today and to be part of this great panel discussion. So as you mentioned, Ronald McDonald House Charities is indeed a global organization. I think many people, and maybe to our good credit, when they think of Ronald McDonald House Charities, they think of the local Ronald McDonald House in their community. And when we talk a little bit later about some of the strengths of being a federated structure, I think that's a real key strength for us, that we have such an incredible position in so many local communities. But really, we are in 65 countries and regions. We have an all-in revenue around 700 million-ish year to year. And our focus really is on the concept of family-centered care. We have, of course, our core program, which is the Ronald McDonald Houses. We also, though, many people might not know, have our in-hospital Ronald McDonald House family rooms, which provide respite and care right in the hospital, very often near the neonatal units, but also so where families can go in and get a little bit of time. We literally have laundry room facilities. Some of those even have sleeping facilities. So it is a place for a family to take a time out, but still stay very close to their sick or injured child. And then we also have, very importantly, mobile health and education. So we have the Ronald McDonald Care Mobiles, and those are deployed all over the world. We provide care in communities, for example, in Indonesia, where children don't have access in some areas to pediatric care. So we work with local provider partners in those areas. In the U.S., a lot of those care mobiles focus on dental services, and certainly many of them focus on education. So the breadth of what we do really is about providing psychosocial, emotional, and very much economic support to families in need. Last year alone, we saved families with a sick or injured child $980 million in food and lodging. So my dream is to be able to say $1 billion. We're knocking on the door of being able to say that we're saving these families at the most critical time in their lives to save that, to have that support. And I'll also close with the issue around really what COVID has done to our operations and how we've had to show a huge level of resiliency, not only in the operations, but also when we'll talk about this more, I know, in the fundraising. We used 550,000 volunteers across the world. So in order to stop the spread, the social spread, we had to disband our volunteer programs that provide. So imagine losing a workforce of 550,000, basically part-time. So the pressure that's put on our system to be able to continue to provide service. So we're seeing increased costs. At the same time, like we're going to talk about, fundraising events are down for sure, and other types of fundraising have been challenged. But we are moving forward with it. We are persevering as a chapter system, and I think we are going to come back out the other side of this stronger because we have worked very much in concert as a system, and we have stayed true to the North Star of our values and our focus on providing care for these families.
Thank you. Helene, tell us a little bit more about the Chicago Community Trust. It's both a granting and a fundraising organization, and maybe some of your reactions to the Giving USA results and how that may have changed over the last 6 months. I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, and great to be part of this great panel. As you said, community foundations are kind of this interesting blend of both a fundraiser, if you will, but also a grant maker. And we, as you mentioned in the introduction, Chicago Community Trust is one of the oldest community foundations. We've been around for about 105 years. And we exist to be able to provide a place where people can invest their philanthropic dollars to make a difference in the community that they call home. And so, we work with a large array of donors who believe that investing in their community through a community foundation, which knows where their dollars can best be leveraged, where the biggest challenges are, we work with them to be able to invest their dollars and make sure that they're put to the best use in ways that can make a big difference in the community. And as you noted also, about a year or so ago, we launched a new strategy focused on the issue of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in Chicago, because we felt that, while we could focus on a lot of different issues that impact our city and our region, fundamental and core to all of those issues, whether it's the 30-year life expectancy gap that we see between people who live downtown or in some of the west and south side neighborhoods, whether it's lack of access to high quality education, violence, lack of unemployment and disinvestment in neighborhoods, et cetera, that all of these things will be helped in the long term if you get at the root cause of this, which is this gaping wealth inequality that exists. and has existed for a long time, mainly and dramatically along racial and ethnic lines. And we know that the roots of racial segregation in Chicago, just like many other urban cities, is at the core of a lot of these challenges. And we're seeing it play out as we look at the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, or whether we look at the response to the George Floyd murder and the uprisings that followed that murder. So, on and on. I think we took this on as an issue because we recognized how core and fundamental it is to solving other key challenges. So I'm actually always enthusiastic when I see the Giving USA report, because I think it does say that Americans continue to be generous and continue to want to make a difference in their neighborhoods, their communities, nation, and even the world. I was sorry to see the internet, having spent 10 years running an international organization and doing a lot of my work in global health. It was unfortunate to see that we are in a place where people are thinking less about the rest of the world than I think we as the wealthiest nation in the world can afford to do. That said, it was good to see that the overall trend, even after some of the concerns people had about the tax, the changes in the tax legislation that could have had a damper on giving. And so I'm pleased to see that we continue to be generous. And I think, we'll probably talk more about what has that meant post 2019 in this COVID era around giving. But I think it does continue to show that there's huge opportunity for continuing to fundraise, continuing to have people want to give to important causes. And I think, as was noted in the presentation, shaping your message and crafting it so that you are your impact and how you will make a difference is clear to donors, I think is an important piece of this.
Thank you. Stacy, I think most people probably on this webinar today read the Chronicle frequently and feel they know a little bit about it, but tell us more about it. And the Chronicle published a lengthy analysis of these results this morning, and tell us a little bit about the reaction that you and the Chronicle have to these results.
Thanks so much. And I want to thank all of the nonprofit folks on this call, because this has been such a difficult time and you're doing such important work. And I hope you know that we all appreciate it greatly. And I know these numbers coming out feels a bit like a report card, in terms of how did you do last year? And some groups did do a lot better than others. But we certainly saw, as Helene said, an outpouring of generosity. We've been talking to lots of nonprofit officials about what do these findings actually tell us about 2020, and they tell us a lot. The most important thing is that there were the signs of the recession or the downturn coming. If you recall, in December, there was a really turbulent stock market. And I think that's why we saw that even in what was mostly a good economic year, the results weren't as stellar as they otherwise might have been. So there was a bit of softness. The groups that did the best certainly were education and arts organizations, and those are among the organizations that are now most challenged, as we see campuses being closed, arts institutions unable to open. So they started off at least with a better cushion. So we can see that some of those trends are going on. And I know one of the most important things, obviously, is engaging individuals. And we saw, again, the trends that we've all been seeing for a long time is that the wealthy are giving very generously. Some of you may know we do a special feature that documents the 50 most generous Americans. And those people are giving at extraordinary rates. We're going to need to have those wealthy people continue to give and find ways to encourage them to do it, because obviously with the unemployment rate being what it is, and that's expected to go on for a while, that's going to be the biggest challenge for so many nonprofit organizations.
I thought it was so interesting that the Philanthropy 50 gave so much to environmental causes. This is not part of the prepared questions that I gave you, but what do you make of that trend? It's just, it's a very interesting, I think, growth in the last, it's really more of a 10-year trend than a one-year trend, but Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was really phenomenal. We usually don't see climate change coming up as something that the very rich donors give their very biggest gifts to. And this year we saw that they were. And many of them said, you know, I'm really worried about my grandchildren. The more they talk to me, the more they tell me. I think Greta Thunberg made a big difference. All of those kids demonstrating in various ways. And I think, you know, if we look generally at what's going on in society right now, we're all following what young people are doing in various ways. And that's leading to charitable donations. So if you watch what's happening in the movements, we're seeing it in terms of charitable giving. So the very wealthy are watching and much more interested, much more concerned about the planet. And I think that's going to be interesting to see how that continues even in the downturn, but I think it will be very strong still.
Well, I want to stay with you one more question and then go back to the other panelists. But, you know, so the Philanthropy 50 and giving from the very wealthy is as strong, looks like as strong as it's ever been. What the data kind of hides is that there is a downward trend in the number of families or households in this country giving. And I know that the Chronicle follows this and myriad other data that supports this. One is the Lilly Family Philanthropy Panel study, which estimates that the share of families giving has dropped 13% from 2000 to 2016. What do you make of that? And I'm going to ask the other panelists to chime in after you do. And what can we do to counteract it? We know that this is a generous country, but is this a emerging crisis in broad-based generosity? What's it all about?
I think it's really important that you flag that. And I will say that one of the things that's happened in the past few months is that we've seen rising trust in nonprofits compared to other organizations. And I think that is a critical thing. So I think in some ways, nonprofits have already done the key thing that needed to be done, is that they've really been shining in this crisis. And they're shining compared to many government agencies as well. And the American people see that. I think all that communication that nonprofits have had has really made a difference. We've released a couple polls that have shown a really dramatic increase in how much people have faith in nonprofits. That faith is critical to encouraging people to give. The other thing, obviously, is just making sure that people really understand, while we celebrate all of these gifts from the very wealthy, what your $100 gift does. How does it make a difference? Why does it matter that I give? And if that's something that people can work on while they're not as busy with the galas and all of those other things, is really thinking through that issue of how do I show that a small gift really does make a difference. The more we can do that and reinforce that message, the more people will consider giving, because we don't really want, part of our democracy is about everybody giving, everybody participating. So I think it is very worrisome, not just for the dollar fundraising totals, but really for how our country runs. We need to get people feeling good about giving again.
So Kelly, please, I was going to say that RMHC, I think, does get broad-based support. Has it changed in recent years?
Yeah, we sure do. I was going to say, if I could hook on that comment from Stacy, I think this is a real opportunity for all of us with all of the groundswell, especially, I hate to bring up the word millennial this early in a discussion, but really understanding that people are action-oriented, that they want to, and finding a way to connect where their passion is and where their concern is for members of the community, to really, as Stacy was saying, to evidence to them what their dollars, what their contribution will do, that it is not going out to some big fund in the universe, and that we need to be able to show tangible evidence that what we're doing as nonprofits and organizations are really providing the kind of social benefits that they want to be involved in, and that supporting these nonprofits that are already in place is an action step on their part to be able to affect change. And I think really taking a hard look at that, and we started during this time, as I know many of our my fellow colleagues have, really doing a better job, as Stacy said, instead of planning galas and events, really looking at what is the cadence of our messaging, especially to our current donors. What does that look like? How are we really telling our story, and how are we evidencing the impact that we're having and continue to have, and importantly, what their role in that could be, and what actions they can take. There are so many people who feel somewhat powerless right now. let's find a way to give them back a sense of power in terms of how they can move something forward. Let's make sure that we evidence to them that we're part of that path, right? And what does that look like? And I think if we do that, I think we're going to marshal a lot of the emotion and intention that a lot of people have right now and put it into tangible action and results.
Helene, tell us about the generosity that happens in neighborhoods when you're trying to affect change that might not show up in this data. For one thing, this is only about giving. It's not about volunteering. Some of us are moving toward a concept of generosity that is inclusive of both giving and volunteering. But you really have to rely on people in the neighborhoods to affect change long term, do you not?
Yeah, sure. And let me pick up on a couple of other points in answering that. Stacy's point, I think, is worth repeating in that giving is not just about the dollars that are contributed, but it is about an ethos. It's about a culture. It's about who we think we are as a people. And so, I think being able to appeal to that as much as the actual dollar aspect, that when you give, you're playing a part of positive change in your community. And so I feel like giving is almost like voting. It's something that people ought to feel like, this is just something that we do. That said, I think, to the points that several have made, this is a new generation. And we have, as we think about what millennial giving and what incentivizes millennials, I think it also means we have to think differently about how we talk about fundraising, organizations, and ways in which we can appeal differently. And so to your point, millennials are more inclined to be involved with something that they can actually get involved with themselves. And I think this notion of how do we get people's sweat equity along with the dollars that they contribute, and think of different vehicles. Again, when I talk to millennial philanthropically oriented groups, they are much more interested in things like impact investing than pure out and out donations. So we have to be, as organizations, nimble in how we're thinking about this, because we've got a whole new generation who has different tools, different ways of communicating, and they're not just going to do something because my father, my grandfather, my grandmother did this. We're going to do it because we believe in it, and we give some of ourselves in the process of it. So I think it really gives a lot of opportunity for new ways of thinking as we think about how do we appeal not just to the generation of donors yesterday. And I would bet so many of us bemoan the fact that we have an elderly donor base and aren't really always thinking about how do we appeal to today and the future generations of philanthropists.
Thank you. Let's switch gears here a little bit. Kelly, RMHC is both a distinct and, as you explained, significant organization. It's international, and yet people sort of think of it as being on every corner. It lives in healthcare and human service for some. It has a large donor base and significant grassroots volunteers with local groups regularly preparing meals. How do these factors combine to create the giving picture and strategy at RMHC? And what are the most important things to sustaining support going forward?
Sure. I think this works beautifully with what Helene was just saying. So I think one of our core strengths is that we are at our core a grassroots-driven organization. We are community-based programs, and we are, as I mentioned, so well supported by a volunteer base. We run very lean with our staffs on the chapter level because we have this volunteer support. So what this does is it provides opportunity for people to be involved, to touch and feel the mission. And so they come in, they do everything from young Girl Scout troops and Boy Scout troops coming in and baking cookies, so that even at a young age they start to see what service looks like, and they start to see what need looks like. all the way through, as you mentioned, the food service programs. We have people that come in breakfast, lunch, and dinner, providing food for the families. We also have, we have education, on-site education. So we have reading programs. We have myriad types of programs where people can come in and actually interact with the families and interact with the programs. So that provides that sense, that combination of sweat equity, if you will. We also have gardens that are now affiliated with these houses. We have all types of opportunities for people to come in and actually work on improving the physical structure of the houses as well. So that marries up that, once you've tasted, touched, and felt our mission, and you've seen the families, it brings you into the fold in a way that any kind of an email communication or clever social post is not going to do. So I think we have the real benefit of that spread out again across the world. But then we also have a very robust architecture of data tracking, so that we can then we can aggregate all of the impact that we're having around the world, and we track that very carefully. And that would be one sort of takeaway that I would want to leave with folks on the nonprofit side on this call today. That's what makes us effective. The fact that we have spent years building out an internal architecture that does an information and outcomes report every year from each region, each chapter, that really digs in very deeply and very broadly on all aspects of outcomes, that we were able to pull those all together on the global level and then talk to major foundations for support. So but in order to be able to do that effectively, you have to, I think what happens in nonprofit structures is that a lot of times they'll find out about a foundation or a potential gift, and then they will scurry to try to find data that is going to support it. But if you're collecting that data day in and day out, week in and week out, and it's at your fingertips, you are ready to respond quickly when there is an opportunity for funding on a global level. And we've been able to evidence and do that.
Stacy, how does that reflect the best practices that you all profess in your webinars, or how else would you build on the observations that Kelly just made there?
Well, absolutely. Evaluation and impact is incredibly important. And it's not just for foundation gifts, but really that goes back to what we were talking about how to show people that you're making a difference. Absolutely people care about having their hearts tugged at, but they really want their brains engaged, and they can't figure out how we're doing what we're doing. And so they need more information. So I think that that's an incredibly important thing, finding other ways also to get people engaged. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is just how important it is to tap into these skilled volunteers who are, at home, can use technology, can do the many things that they really, it's unfortunate, and you really demonstrated, Kelly, why it's so difficult not to have those volunteers actually in place. But there is so much that people can contribute in so many ways that we need to find ways to tap into that. And as we know, those people tend to become the most dedicated donors. So the more we can bring people in at various levels, one of the questions I get asked a lot by reporters these days is, how do I tell people who have no money how they can help? Because a lot of people don't, if you, depending on what your situation is, and we need to have better answers for how people can become engaged and what they can do. And I know that's a lot to think of when people are recreating services and doing things, but this is such a moment when people want to get involved for lots of different reasons. They want to help, and we need to find ways to do that. So, that would be another thing that I would dedicate a staff chat on is, how do we do that? What opportunities are we offering? And really, what do we need when we talk about a skilled volunteer? Do we need help with marketing? What is it that people could do to make a difference? The more they hear about that, the more I think we'll turn around this problem of the decline in middle-class donors.
One of the things we always stress with all the organizations we work with is your volunteers are potential donors, and they are showing that they care about the mission of the organization, and you need to steward them just like you steward donors. And frankly, what we found with our clients is that somebody who volunteers, sometimes organizations think, well, geez, I don't know if I want to ask them to make a gift, but in fact, they are highly likely to support the organization financially. All you have to do, in many cases, is ask. You know, Helene, people are so interested on how giving has changed, and even in the last 6 months as a result of COVID and the movement and, frankly, anger about racial disparity. These are two areas that Chicago Community Trust has been an especially active leader. And I remember when you first came to the trust, I asked you why you came from CARE to the trust, and you said you felt that the future of change would happen locally rather than maybe nationally or internationally. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe if you could tell us a little bit about the initiative to close the wealth gap and the response where CCT partnered with United Way to try to help those in need during the pandemic. CCT as a community leader of change.
Well, I now know I'm going to watch what I say to somebody who has a better memory about what I say than I did. But I think I do remember that I said that. And, you know, in fact, it was a lot of my motivation for coming to the Chicago Community Trust, is that having spent 30 years of my career primarily doing global or national work, that to be able to, at a time where I think a lot of the innovation and social change is going on at the community level, to be part of that, I thought was something that really motivated and inspired me. And so, you know, we have gone on this journey to really look at this kind of root cause issue of the racial and ethnic wealth gap, understanding that, you know, while a lot of our strategy is focused on households and communities who have not had economic opportunity, that the real, you know, overall advantage is for the whole society. Because if we can make sure that 2/3 of our population here in the Chicago area has the opportunity to contribute to the economy, our whole economy grows. And so I think, you know, oftentimes people focus on this as a justice and an equity issue, which it is, and it is a key part of why we're doing it. But it's also a hardcore economic reality that if you hold back large swaths of your population, you are holding back the economy overall. So, you know, when we developed our strategy, we wanted to be pretty practical about it, and we laid out some steps focused on three levels. One, how do you increase household wealth? Two, how do you increase investment in neighborhoods where there has been disinvestment? And then three, how do you build community voice so that the people who live in communities are actually actors in their own solutions, and that their narratives and their voices are part of bringing change. So, you know, we have sub buckets under all of those, but those are the ways in which we're trying to look at how do you grow household wealth, how do you improve investment in disinvested neighborhoods, and how do you support community in creating change themselves. And I think, you know, that only became more relevant, if you will, as COVID occurred, as we started to see this disproportionate impact of both the health aspects, where Black and Brown communities were disproportionately impacted by COVID, but also the economic impact, because, you know, this is a public health crisis that has forced us to have an economic crisis at the same time because of the measures we needed to take. And as we saw this very same communities that we were addressing in our strategy be the communities that were most hard hit, it only redoubled our efforts, and I think in some ways added to the urgency and the relevance of what we did. And so, as you alluded to, the trust, along with the United Way of Metropolitan Chicago, mounted a fund, a response fund to COVID-19. And it was pretty actually a tremendous story, because in 48 hours, we raised $8 million. We're able to launch this fund, start getting dollars out to communities hard hit by this pandemic. And, we've been able to raise $35 million overall. We've given out over $24 million to hundreds of organizations for food, for shelter, for getting cash into people's hands so they could pay their bills, so that people who were really hurting during this crisis had somewhere to go to find some relief, and that the organizations that represent those communities also were able to provide the kind of help and put them in the position to be able to make a difference at this incredibly urgent moment. We also helped the state to mount a similar fund where they were able to raise $30 million to be able to meet the needs outside of the Chicago region. So, long way of saying, I think this ability to double down on these issues of inequity at a moment of real urgency, I think has, I think the fact that we had started on this journey really positioned us well as we saw COVID, as well as the events following the murder of George Floyd.
Thank you. Stacy, build on those comments. You've had an opportunity, I'm guessing, to observe many different movements across the country in the last several months. What have you learned that correlates with what Helene is saying here about how to impact change in such a timely way?
Yeah, it really has been remarkable. And, I really think it's important to note just, really in terms of dollars, how much has been pouring into things like the bail funds and all these other efforts. People are really galvanized, and they are putting dollars into these things. So I think we really need to find ways to tap and build into that energy in various ways. And I think it strikes me that, we've seen a lot of doing things differently in the COVID era. For example, one of the other areas a lot of donors are giving to is, making cash, helping people get cash. So, Give Directly, some of those other organizations that have been pioneering this idea of just, giving people in need basically money rather than all of the things that we do to intervene and, make sure that they have all these bureaucratic requirements. Well, that's been a tremendous difference in terms of how people are responding. Those kinds of new ways that people were putting pressure to change the way nonprofits work for a long time, and yet it just took this crisis to all of a sudden people moved quickly, they took action, and they did things. And so now the question is, how do we keep that energy going? But it is people working together and building on those movements in so many ways, and that's where organizations like community foundations can make such a difference to provide that infrastructure. A lot of that is behind the scenes, and we don't talk about it as much as we probably should, but that's what has been very powerful. It's also been some of the local donors have been making a big difference in their own communities, and so those aren't always the household names, but they're igniting this in communities around the country too, so that's been important.
Thank you. Kelly, any comments here? I think you're on mute.
Keep doing that. I agree with all that's said. The only thing I would add, I think it's really, I like, Stacy, what you said, that now people are moving quickly on things that have been talked about for a while. And one of the things that I think would be interesting to see is more work around, that what we've all been talking about for years around collective impact strategies and collaboration. And, the barrier to that, very often, it's been my experience, especially with the Atlanta Women's Foundation and with a lot of the work we did on the local level for Susan G. Komen for screening for underserved communities, is these nonprofit staffs are so small, they are so lean, that the idea of then putting another layer of putting together collaboration and putting together a shared set of impacts that these organizations could all work towards, I think sometimes there just isn't the infrastructure in place in some of these grassroots organizations that is needed, but to have that other funding source and that architecture of a community foundation, of some of the women's foundations, other types of community organizations to come in and put those cohorts together so that we can quickly move towards really truly solving, if not having a major impact on some of these issues. And I think that we're seeing that, even if it's not being articulated as that, with how quickly individual organizations are moving in this COVID, trying to move forward and respond. But I think even better coordination of some of that down the road is still would still be really beneficial and needed.
Yeah, thank you. I want to switch gears here a little bit, and Helene, I'm going to start with you again because of the topic. Giving to and from donor-advised funds is really changing the landscape of philanthropy. It's arguably impacting two different category results here: public society benefit, where the for-profit donor-advised fund giving is counted, and foundations, because so many donor-advised funds are housed in community foundations like Chicago Community Trust. There's a lot of conversation about donor-advised funds. Once people create these, do they give enough out of them for the right kind of impact? Should they be perhaps regulated and like foundations are and have a minimal amount that should be given from it every year? Should there be greater transparency? I'm just interested in the big picture about tell us why and how donor-advised fund giving is really important to the community foundation and maybe to philanthropy overall as this trend continues.
Yeah, thanks. And, donor advised funds, I think, are an incredibly important philanthropic vehicle. And they clearly are the fastest growing part of our business. We have either donor advised funds, primarily either donor advised funds or endowed funds. And donor advised funds are often the way in which people get enough experience with a particular community foundation to then want to actually bequest and contribute to an endowment. So it's both incredibly important for what it does today, but also potentially for what it does tomorrow in terms of our ability to make a difference. Nobody wants to be regulated. So, clearly we would not be pushing for legislating DAFs, and partly because we feel like they work well as they're set up. And so, we have something like, as opposed to the 5% giving for private foundations, we have closer to 20% in terms of money going out of DAFs a year. So people use these vehicles for getting dollars out. They're efficient because you've got the money there. And so, for instance, during this crisis, even though people might have been feeling poorer and their personal investments not doing as well, because the money was already there, people were motivated to give. And so, it's an incredibly effective vehicle for organizing your philanthropy, for having your family engaged in it. We have a lot of donor advised funds that have that are family donor advised funds, which allow families to talk about their philanthropy together and make decisions and choices about how they contribute without all of the administrative difficulty of setting up a private foundation. So we think that they are an incredibly important giving vehicle. We know that there are probably ways in which they are abused, but I think we're, as a community foundation community, really looking at those things so that we can actually impose accountability on ourselves, because we're motivated to make sure that money gets out there.
Yeah. Stacy, the Chronicle's published a lot on this. Give us some thoughts about donor advised funds.
Well, one of the things we've been tracking is just how generously the money is going out the door. And in the past couple of months, the community foundations and the commercial funds have all seen a great deal of interest in their donors in getting money out the door. So I think we are starting to see that. There's also been some activism among some donors to say, we all ought to encourage each other to give more. There's a movement called Half My DAF that you may have seen, where some donors are matching other donors who deplete at least half of their donor advised fund now to say, this money is really needed now. And this really gets into a broader conversation I think we're all having about the role of any kind of endowed fund is, how much do we use now and how much do we use for tomorrow? And that's an important conversation for people to have. But the number of times I think we've published in our pages, people saying, if we're saving for a rainy day, it's really raining now. That is a very common expression and a common sentiment to say, like, if not now, when? And so I think, anybody who has a donor advised fund is probably feeling that pressure to think about how to give generously, and those who are involved, both in the fundraising and the giving side, need to think about that. The figures from Giving USA were really striking, of just how much money has gone into them, and I think we've all been seeing that all along. But there is enormous growth and enormous potential, and now what nonprofits need a bit of help on is figuring out how to tap into those funds. Even though we all know they're here, people don't understand them and don't know how to get them. We have some resources on our site that can help people do that. It's not that complicated. It sounds like it is. It really isn't, and it's really basically good donor relations. Any affluent donor probably has a donor advised funds. Assume they have it and ask them for the money. It really, there are a few regulations to worry about, but I think people obsess about that instead of saying, I really need to, seek that money and it will come, because I think people really do want to give. And, the advised funds are full and their coffers are available. Now fundraisers need to find ways to go get them.
And I was
so Kelly, I see you nodding. How do we tap these funds?
Yeah, I know. I think it's funny. I couldn't agree more. And it's to be honest, not to give away our own strategy on this call, but it's definitely an area of focus for us. It's an underutilized area for sure, and it's something that we've been talking a lot about. At the end of the day, what you just said, though, Stacy, though, to us, it's just been in some cases the vehicle by which the relationships that we've had with major donors, that's really just how we've looked at it. But yes, this is definitely an area that we want to focus on going forward. And we realized in full transparency, we're probably a little bit behind with that. But the other way to look at it is there's a lot of opportunity that we haven't tapped into yet. So that's one of the key areas we're looking at. To date, it's really been it's all about as usual with major gifts, about relations, and it's really been just looked at as well. Some of them use this, some of them don't. But now it's time for us to get much more intentional about how we're accessing those funds.
Yeah, thank you. I have other questions, but I thought I'd check with my colleague Emily to see if there's anything that's come in from the audience that we want to ask. Emily, are you there?
Yes, we do have several questions. I'll start with a few and then let you continue the conversation. The first question is, there is a lot of competition between nonprofits, especially in arts and education. How can we support one another while also ensuring our organization captures the donations it needs?
Who wants to take a swing at that?
Well, I guess I would say, it is, there will always be duplication. There's no way to expect that we will ever have kind of a perfectly coordinated nonprofit sector. But I think funders can actually incentivize collaboration among organizations in ways that bring out the complementary strengths of different organizations. And so I think in the way that we fund, we can minimize competition and actually maximize collaboration. And then I think we actually have kind of a multiplier effect versus extreme duplication.
I think what from the giving results, I think you mentioned, and I was heartened to hear coming into this time period that both arts and education came in at a stronger position, that there was a nice bump in funding, because clearly those are areas of concern right now. I think people are going to be really looking at funding immediate need coming out of that we're in COVID, and then also areas around social justice, I think, and so the public benefit, I think, is going to continue. And I really do wonder, going into this year, this upcoming year, what's going to happen, because they're suffering, arts and education, we know, the double whammy, right, inability to get patrons, inability to even open schools potentially, or what that's going to look like. And then I think a lot of donors are going to be very focused on human services, organizations, social benefit. So I think it's going to be a tough row to hoe, and I agree. Any kind of collaboration that can be done to strengthen them is going to be very important.
Thank you.
Trends, the histories.
Go ahead.
Tina, go ahead.
Oh, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make a comment that the historic trends are very clear in both giving to arts and giving to education. When the stock market is strong, these organizations, in terms of their philanthropy, prosper, and they are destinations for large gifts of appreciated securities from wealthy donors. Donors to arts organizations in particular tend to live in urban areas. This is research that Campbell and Company funded with Lilly some time ago. They tend to live in urban areas. They tend to be more educated than the average donor, and they tend to support many organizations. And then when they are in the right position, they make a big gift to their favorite arts organization. And so the data would suggest that both of these institutional types are going to have challenging years. We are interested as a firm about whether this moment of change might also represent a moment of change in giving to arts and culture organizations, because so many of them have had generous responses from their close friends when they've had to close their doors and they've been in dire straits. So it'll be very interesting to see how all that turns out. Emily, anything else?
Yes, we have two more questions. The next question is, many organizations have put most activity on hold. Do you agree, or do you see this as a great time to solidify relationships?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Yes, many organizations have put most activity on hold. Do you agree, or do you see this as a great time to solidify relationships?
Yes.
Kelly?
I see this as a time for stewardship. This is a time to be reaching out, at least on the donor side, but also on the volunteer side. I think phone calls of checking on people's welfare, thank you phone calls are imperative. I think it's imperative right now. These folks need to know that they're not just donors to us or not just volunteers to us, but they're valued. And I think those reach out calls without an attached ask this is the time while you are shifting resources away from maybe some of the programs to start to shift that into that philanthropy mindset, so that it's everybody. Culture of philanthropy, really operationalize that now and start shifting folks that wouldn't normally be traditional fundraisers, to making those phone calls, making those touch bases. Folks that are running operations in our houses, or people that are running programs, because you're not asking them to turn into fundraisers. You're asking them to just check on what are friends, right? These are people that have become friends and colleagues to them. So no, I think this is the opportune time to do that.
Stacy, I see you nodding.
Emily. Oh, sorry.
I think that's exactly right. And, the other thing to think about, I do think it's great to get more employees involved in that. These are hard times for people who are doing the work, if their programs are stalled, and for them to have that chance to engage with the donor, that's a wonderful way to lift their morale as well. And we have also heard from a number of fundraisers who say how happy people are to pick up the phone now. And really, it doesn't need to be these fancy video calls. It can be just talking on the telephone. People miss that sense of association. So I really think it goes on both sides, both for who makes the call and who receives the call. And we need to do more of that.
Thank you. Tina, you wanted to comment, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that's been said, and I'd like to add that there are some folks who are ready to make gifts during this time and able to, and actually so grateful that they have that opportunity. So in the case where you do have donors that are ready to do so, I encourage you to continue with your solicitations. The other thing is that if you have a situation in your organization where the work you're doing is really on point and relevant with today's times, and you need the money to carry out the work, I say you be bold and you ask for it, because that is how we're going to get the work done. So encourage you along that path, not to just sit back and wait.
Spoken like a fundraising consultant. Thank you. Emily, I think you said there was one other question.
Yes, actually, before we wrap up Q&A, there is one audience comment that I'd like to share with you all. This audience member says, please thank the panelists for having an actual conversation about engaging millennials. As a millennial myself, who has been fundraising my entire career and as a philanthropist in my own right, I cringe whenever I hear the M word, because we're usually boiled down to a group who only wants to do Facebook birthday fundraisers. Not true. I appreciated the actual conversation around how to engage those of us who want to see the impact of our giving. So thank you all.
And I would just say, we have giving circles within the trust, and we have giving circles that are specific to different communities, but we also have one that is a young professionals giving circle. And it is really one of the ones that I just enjoy going to the most, because what they do, they pool resources and then they make collective decisions about where their dollars will go. And, to see them engaging in this way, and they, because it's all Chicago, they actually go visit these organizations, do due diligence on them, and then they engage with the organization once they've given them the grant. And so I just do believe that there's a generation of young people who care so deeply about their communities and care so deeply about the world, and are bringing different kinds of competencies into this. So I think it's pretty exciting.
It's very exciting. We started a program in Atlanta with the Atlanta Women's Foundation called Aspire, and it was a young professional about women, and it was also women finding their voice in leadership. So it was a combination of building community leaders and potential board members and board development for them, but also with them doing fundraising and pooling it, just as you're talking about. And it has, as they say, caught fire. It is, and it is really paying dividends well beyond what the original intent of the program was. So it's really teaching philanthropy at its base, and it's really exciting and necessary.
I have a question I want to ask here. Giving seems to rise every year. It's different if you're reporting the inflation-adjusted numbers or the actual dollars, but it seems to go up almost every year. And yet, as Tina mentioned in her presentation, we can't seem to get beyond 2.1% of gross domestic product. We seem, and giving is closely linked to the economy, as we've noted, whether it's personal disposable income, pre-tax corporate profit, and other such data like the S&P 500. How do we break through and significantly expand philanthropy beyond these economic limitations that have been present in the data so long? I know when we were talking earlier this week, Kelly, you said you were really interested in this question, so I'm going to ask you to comment first.
Well, I think we've touched on it a little bit. I think overall in this conversation today, I think that I think we need to look at philanthropy in a completely different way. I think we need to connect the dots for people around what their actions are and how that can affect change. And I think that there is this groundswell, be it millennials, be it anybody really. I mean, we've talked about millennials, the younger group, but it kind of reminds me, and I don't want to get in trouble here, but it kind of reminds me of politics and voting. I have noticed over the past many years that people don't connect who they vote for and what their political party is with the policy that is made. So there seems to be this disconnect that they're going to vote Republican or Democrat, but they don't really know how that translates to policy. And then when they hear the results of their vote and the results of the party in power, and then they start to see the policies that are coming out, they say to themselves, my gosh, I don't agree with these policies, but I'm a this or I'm a that. And I feel like there is a very similar potential opportunity here, and what I see as a disconnect between people really understanding what philanthropy is and the social good, again, getting back to the results, the social good of what is produced and how they can translate their thoughts. And what I keep going back to, I've been harping on this with all my friends in philanthropy, everybody has intention. Everybody has good intention. Everyone wants, they intend to do this and they have all these grand thoughts. But how do we harness that? How do we translate that appropriately into, there is a host of opportunity for you in all forms of philanthropy where you can move social change forward. You can move science forward. You can find a cure for cancer. And you do that by harnessing all of that talent. It's the classic, right? Talent, time, and treasure. But truly, how do we connect those dots that these things exist in the world? And if you want to see change in the world, these are the ways that you can do it. It's tangible. And I feel like I think we all try to do that, and we all have been learning over the last 20, 30 years how to make our missions more tangible so that they're more understandable, so that people see the result better and they feel more connected to it. But I think writ large, there's a hunger, at least U.S., if we're just talking U.S.-based especially, there is a hunger for systemic change in so many areas. And how we connect that to the institutions and the channels that are already in place to do that is, I think it's where we need to go, and I think we're at the precipice of being able to do that.
Stacy, what are your thoughts about the economic limitations of giving and how we break through it, or building maybe on what Kelly said here?
I agree with what she said. This year is going to be a tough year to talk about expanding giving, because I think we'll all be happy if things can just stay even. So it's easier to have those conversations in a healthy economy than it is in one that is as challenged as we have. I think one thing we haven't talked too much about in this conversation is the role of government and what kind of incentives it might offer in terms of encouraging people to give. And, there are fewer tax breaks for middle-class donors these days. Congress has restored a bit with the $300 temporary tax deduction after COVID. But that's important, not just because people give and because of the tax break itself, but it signals that government thinks it's important too, that being a good donor is being part of a good citizen. And so, I think one of the things we're seeing is growing interest in finding ways for government perhaps to signify that and coming up with a way to do that. So that might be another way to encourage greater giving, and really focused on those everyday donors. Certainly we know that wealthy Americans still have a lot of tax breaks available to them, but if you're an average donor, you don't. And we may want to do more to push for those as well.
Yeah, well, there was a 64% drop in those itemizing their taxes with the tax reform law that went into existence in 2018. Anything to add on this topic, Helene, about how we can get to a larger place?
So, a few things. First of all, and this is something that we're doing, getting to know your donors better. I think that sometimes we take our donor and our donor base for granted, and we're now involved in a project to actually more deeply both engage, but also get to know our donors better, so that we're better able to understand where their interests are and meet them where they are. And so, I would say know your donors. Two, I think, being able to continue to innovate in the products that we make available. I mentioned impact investing earlier. We have started, we have an impact investing platform now that people who have donor advised funds with us, as opposed to investing in traditional means, they can actually now put some of their dollars into an impact investing vehicle that allows them to kind of have, you know, even more impact, because their dollars are being invested in things that have a social mission as part of it. So, you know, I think the more that we can think about innovation, I think it was measured a few times, it was mentioned a few times before, being able to demonstrate impact. I think people are motivated when they know that you can talk about what good you actually did in a tangible way. And so I think the more that we're able to tell our impact story, the more I think we can bring donors to the table and new donors to the table. And then finally, I think the more we get community voice at the center of this, because when we are able to take our donors, which we do, to visit projects, to come to some of the neighborhoods and, you know, be proximate, if you will, to the issues that are facing everyday people's lives, they become more generous. And so I think we can't underestimate how important it is to make real to people what the challenges are that we're dealing with. And you can't do that any better than actually talking to people themselves.
Yeah. Regrettably, we are out of time. I want to thank my colleague, Tina Yoon, for presenting this data, and I want to thank Helene, Gayle, and Stacy Palmer and Kelly Dolan for a wonderful panel dialogue. And I know that people who attended really appreciate it. So thank you for being with us. And I just want to say one last thing to our attendees. We really do hope that you'll think about going and buying this data. There's all different products related to the data that's available through the Lilly family, or excuse me, through the Giving USA. The research is done by Lilly family. And if you use the code here, Campbell, you can get a 30% discount off any Giving USA product. And what that does is help fund the research next year. So thank you all for being with us this afternoon, and go forth and prosper and help us build philanthropy and generosity. Thank you.